Hi, this is Kirti Mutatkar, President and CEO at United Ag, and I'm here in Willows, California today to meet with Raymond Rumiano, the co-owner of Rumiano Cheese. I am super excited to be here today, Ray. I flew into Sacramento this morning and drove down to Willows, and what a beautiful drive that was. It felt like I was in Zen country. What a beautiful part of Northern California. So I'm excited to be here. And I'm excited to hear your story. So let's get started. Let's start with where it all started. So Rumiano, last name Italian, right? So your family originated from Italy. So let's hear your story.
Sure. So early 1900s, my great-great-grandfather, Marco Rumiano, he actually immigrated from northern Italy, Piedmont region, found his way to San Francisco. He ended up dabbling in a bunch of different kind of gigs. I'm using air quotes there, but ultimately sending money back. And after about a couple years, I think 1911 was when his three sons, John, Fred, and Richard, were able to come on over from Italy, and they found work in the gold mines in Amador County. And that didn't last too long. I think they got real sick of that. And then they moved back to the San Francisco, the big city, and this is 1912, 1913. So it's really early days there. Allegedly, they dabbled in, winemaking and, other things. And then they ultimately saved up a bunch of money and decided to buy a little tiny creamery here in Willows, California, which is roughly 2 hours.
This is 1914?
This would have been 1919 by this point.
1919.
So they spent quite a bit of time in the Bay Area. 1919 rolls around and they're like, all right, we saved up enough money. We're going to go buy what was then called the Rabbit Dairy here in Willows, California. So the Rabbit Dairy was then turned into the Glenn County Dairy, which was dairy production, strictly milk. And then they realized, wait a minute, what are we going to do with all this milk? We've got a lot of milk and there's no refrigeration, that at least here. So they decided to start making cheese and butter. And then that was really the trajectory. That's how we shot from just, dairying into actually converting that dairy into a, cheese, right? It's much more, has a little bit more shelf life, so to speak, especially without refrigeration, right? So at our old facility, right across I-5 from us now, that's the original dairy. So that was where we had dairied, and then they had started making cheese, and then we had just kind of piecemeal expanded it to include our packaging and distribution. We no longer make cheese here in Willows. We actually ship that. We have that. We no longer make cheese here in Willows. It's all made in Crescent City, California. So right where the Oregon-California border meets Pacific Ocean, little tiny town on the California side. And that's where we get our wondrous milk shed in the Humboldt and Del Norte counties. So they make it all up there. They ship it down to us. We age it, cut, package, and then distribute from Willows. It's a really nice central location. It's, halfway between LA and Portland, pretty close to the Bay, pretty close to Reno. So it's a really kind of central location. So those two facilities are the ones they kept after some expansion and then, closing down some locations. So
amazing. So you're more than 100 years old.
Yeah. So we claim the 1919 was our, so we're 104 roughly, it's really interesting. Obviously family owned the whole time. So.
Right. So from your perspective, right? So coming in from your generation, how does that feel? I mean, there could be people the same kind of generation as yours have moved away from a family business. Why did you feel that you wanted to do this?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. It's kind of a loaded question in a lot of ways. I think, frankly, when I started working, when I hit 15, my dad said, okay, Raymond, it's time to go to work. Where are you going to work? And I was like, oh man, do I have to interview if I go to the factory? No, you can just get a job. So I'm like, oh, I'll go to the factory and work. So I started working probably before I was 15, but labor laws and whatnot. We'll just say 15 now. But, I started labeling cheese and working in our dry jack cellar, which is still over there. It's 100 years old. We age all of our dry jack in there. So I spent a lot of time in our cellar working on our packaging lines, cutting cheese by hand, putting it into bags, sealing it up, labeling it, etc. And, I spent probably close to 10 years in that kind of environment, whether, I kind of moved around in terms of roles and responsibilities. But ultimately, I think that is what calls me back to staying in this is my connection with the people doing the work on the floor, right? Yeah. And understanding the tough effort that it is and the, sometimes thankless. It's frankly is thankless, right? We see a package of cheese on the wall in the grocery store, but the effort and the commitment from people on the floor cutting and wrapping those cheeses, they're probably here more than they see their family. And it's something that I want to strive for, is to how do we make this a better place to work for them? And of course, our farmers, right? We've got 27 partner dairies in Del Norte and Humboldt County. And, they're all family owned. They're generational. A lot of them, I think that the average farm has roughly 300 cows compared to, some of these giant corporations that have, 75,000 cows in their herds. But we're really connected with those farmers, and we're their life, right? Because they can't sell their milk to anyone else, right? So there's just, I think that's one really core driver for me in terms of like why I stick around and why I'm really driven to be a part of this is that there's so many people that our company affects and can affect, that to me it's how do we optimize that and make sure that everyone's finding a win out of this, right? So
that's actually awesome. That's an awesome way of looking at it, because that's what is making it fulfilling for you, right? It's finding fulfillment, because I think deep down, when you really think about it, we reflect back, right? We all need financials, and we all need to do financially well from a business, from personal standpoint, from all of that. But deep down, it's what you just said, makes it fulfilling, because helping other human beings and live life to their fullest and enjoy what they're doing, right?
Exactly.
That's my life passion. That's your look. Seems like it's yours. And the interesting thing that you said was, we see, if you're in Orange County or wherever, you see a cheese on the shelf and you buy it, and you don't necessarily understand every person who's touched this and where it had to go, what it had to go through to come to the point. It happens across the board in any agricultural product. Like you talk about lemons, you talk about strawberries and all of that, right? It's a very interesting journey. So can you, I know you touched on it a little bit, but can you go a little bit deeper for somebody who does not even understand the concept of how cheese is made?
Sure. Well, let's start at the dairy, because that's really where it starts, right? I think it would be a disservice to our dairy producers, but any dairy producer out there if we didn't start there. So it's funny, because we always say it doesn't matter if it's your birthday or if it's a holiday that you celebrate. The cows need to be milked and they need to be cared for, right? So dairying is really kind of one of those thankless jobs that you're producing milk. And we at Rumiano really cherish our dairy partners, because for one, they have a lot of familiar kind of generational effort that they've put in over the generations. But aside from that, the practices that they follow with pasture-based grazing, and there's a lot of sustainability and regenerative practices that they're already implementing that are just traditional methods, right? And also the humane treatment of those animals is like such a key component of that, right? But all that effort that goes into just making sure their cows are happy and healthy and also producing really high quality milk, that's a job in itself. I talk to dairymen here and there and dairywomen, and it is thankless, right? They're providing a really interesting product to us, and then we convert that into a value-added product for, ourselves. And a lot of times, in a lot of industries, those ingredient makers, using some air quotes there, but they're not getting the real fulfilling kind of, the value add that somebody else might get with processing. So I think just noting like the dairying itself is a day in, day out job. It's a commitment. It's a true hands-on job every single day. And then going to our manufacturing facility in Crescent City, right? We've got, 5 to 6 days a week they're making cheese. And there's a team of, I think, roughly about 50 people up there. And, the cheesemakers get up 2 a.m. or they're there by 2 a.m. in the morning to start the cheese making process. And there's a lot of documentation. Now it's a little more automated nowadays, which is super handy and great for consistency, but also a little less hands-on, right? It gives everyone a little bit of a break. But, that's also a really intense job. It's hot and humid in there, and it's not easy. And a lot of the ways we use, make our dry jack, for example, is very manual process. There's no automation besides the making of the curd itself. And then everything from that point on is hand rolling, pressing everything, right? And again, those communities aren't, our community in Willows, Glenn County, the communities up there in Del Norte County, Humboldt, they're not particularly like wealthy communities. So we have a responsibility, I think, of, giving back to those in those communities via these roles and jobs. And then when you bring it all back here, you've got the logistics, the truck drivers spending days apart from their family, right? And they're bringing the cheese down to us in Willows, California, which is, 5.5 hours roughly from Crescent City. But, and then it gets here and then it's stashed in our warehouse for aging. And then when it's getting ready to go, we have our office team, we have schedulers preparing for what to run, what needs to go down what line. And then the people out on the floor, they're actually handling the cheese. They're here at, working 10-hour days up to, 6 days a week sometimes. And it is, again, thankless, right? They're physically grabbing these 40-pound blocks. They're loading them up. They're documenting all this important traceability information. They're sending it down that line. It's getting packaged, and then it's getting put into a box and then put into our warehouse, and then ultimately sent out to those distributors or retailers where you just see it on the shelf. You're like, oh, beautiful. Yep. 6 slices in a package. I will take that. Beautiful. And you don't really think about it, right? And that certainly just, I haven't mentioned even our sales teams and the marketing and the efforts that the kind of mid-management that has to put in all that effort to make sure all of that runs really fluidly. There's just so much effort that goes into that I think, I'm speaking for cheese, but, we can recognize that transcends, this is food, I think, in a lot of ways, right?
Exactly.
So anyway.
That's true. And when you pick that, it's interesting. I don't know if you feel this way, but the taste, why a cheese is because of all the journey that cheese has gone through a little bit, right? Because if you don't start off with the happy cow, right? I mean, that cheese is not going to be, and it actually, my ethnicity is Indian, and cows are considered very sacred. Yeah. I mean, they're like, it's basically we call it, it's a mother of, right, our mom, right? Sure. So that because you're feeding everything, that's how a cow is seen as a very sacred. But you start off with that, you treat that well, make sure and then that ends up being in the superior cheese that we eat. Exactly.
That's the key, right? Is the treatment of the animal, not to mention the food, right? And we can get into the milk shed up there a little later.
Yeah. It's awesome. I mean, and it's again doing right by the people, I think. But the interesting part with United Ag, so we started 40 years ago, and the way United Ag started was a bunch of dairies.
Oh,
so
interesting.
We had a few dairies, and then that was the birth of United Ag as a health plan for dairy industry. So it's very interesting. But the thing was, I think since then what has happened is a lot of dairies are now leaving California. Do you see any pressure from what's going on? You guys are flourishing. You're doing an amazing job and growing. What's happening what do you think? Is it hard to do business here?
I think, frankly, dairying in general is pretty tough. I think, we could get into is it tough to do business in California? But I think just generally, back to that, dairying is a thankless job, and it's really not a, high paying job, so to speak, right? And it's difficult. There's been numerous times where there's, these mass, milk, essentially, there's these companies that are essentially buying, massive amounts of milk from these regions, and then they'll pull out of the region, and now you've left hundreds of dairy folk out of business, right? They have no way to sell their milk, right? And, it's kind of heartbreaking because it's like, these are generational dairies, especially in our region. They're families came from Italy and Portugal or wherever in Europe, right? And stayed here. And now they're seeing all this value that I've built with my brand and my company and my dairy and putting in all this effort. Now it's all gone because nobody's buying my milk, and we can't buy every milk, all of the milk. We only can buy so much, right? So it's hard. And we've seen a lot of dairy people go out of business, especially in the last 10 years, I'd say it's a drastic hit, right? And we've had a couple big milk buyers pull out of California, the northern Redwood Coast and whatnot. And, it's crisis time for them, and I think, that's kind of, frankly, I think as a cheese maker, it's kind of our responsibility just to bring them along with us, make sure that the dairy industry is being, paid back, so to speak. Right. So.
And you're right. It is generations and generations, and it's history and what they bring. Right. I mean, it's the whole, or even the farm, the entire farming from Italy, from Portugal, from other places, and making California their home. And now you feel like, oh, what now?
Exactly.
Right?
I can only imagine. It's kind of earth shattering, right?
Right. It's sad. It's sad.
Yeah.
It's sad. And you see that across the board in other ag products right now. And the importance, I keep telling anybody who can hear me, or I talk to, buy California grown and buy, because this is what we have here as a natural resource, and what has helped all this is amazing. There was a reason why your ancestors came in and settled in California and did it here, right? I mean, you create superior product here.
Right. Yeah.
So, Ray, from your role as you're the marketing communications role at here, what are your challenges? What do you see as your challenge?
That's a great question. I do kind of wear a lot of hats. I think right now I'm very tapped into our marketing kind of efforts. And I think that there's In terms of marketing our product, or just generally, I think marketing any sort of food product, especially dairy at this point, I find it really difficult to, not necessarily difficult. I think that there's kind of this shift going where, dairy doesn't always have the best kind of connotations. When you hear the term, you're like, oh, great, they're treating cows poorly. They're all standing on concrete slabs all day. You're using hundreds of gallons of water per cow every day to just keep that place going in terms of feed. And I think, for me, the way Rumiano's milk producers have done it is so drastically different, but that's what they call traditional, right? Nowadays, we see traditional as like down the Central Valley, and those cows are in essentially a feedlot all day. And it's very different. I'm not to say it's bad or good one way or another by any means, but educating the consumer on what different looks like, right? This very different kind of way of doing dairy. And granted, everyone doesn't have access to the lush green pastures that our cows do every year. 365 days a year, they have open pastures to go graze on. Granted, some days they just want to stay in the barn because it's raining. But, that's probably the hardest part, I think, is differentiating and making sure that people understand, like, we see, the Netflix documentary about the horrors of dairy and meat production and stuff. And that's real. That's all real stuff. And also, there's a very different way of doing it. And that goes with agriculture as well. I think of like regenerative agriculture and how it's really kind of taking hold and understanding of like how we're not just sustaining, but we're regenerating. We're taking, sequestering, GHGs and doing things through essentially these fairly, old school or traditional farming practices that we've kind of lost track of, right? So I don't know. It's just really interesting. It feels like we're all kind of cyclically going back into these old traditional methods that are much more kind of working with the earth versus kind of, this is ours and we're going to use it for what we want, right?
That's such a great perspective. There are a couple of things I want to tease out from there. But just going back to your last point, I interviewed the owner of Babe Farms up in Santa Maria, and he had the same things to say. The traditional way of agriculture, the way we did it, that's the norm, right? Because we understood you have to take care of earth. You have to be sustainable, because it's like the mother, I said the cow, you gives back this. You have to have, these are your resources that have to giving, not just for you, your kids, your grandkids, and you're creating a multi-generational product right here. So how would you abuse that? Because if you abuse that, you might lose it in your own generation and not have it for your kids and your grandkids and stuff. But look at your 1919, and that's when this started. So they had this. So that's like from across the board in agriculture. That's a thing. Going back to something that you said, the negative connotation with dairy and agriculture, you made a really good point that we all put it in one bucket. We call it the agricultural industry. But there are different ways different people are doing different things. It's great for the documentaries and making a great news article to splash things across, and because that makes a great statement that this is happening. But maybe people need to educate themselves, dig a little deeper. For every industry out there are different ways of doing things. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Let me share a little anecdote that I cherish this story, but it kind of leans into what you're talking about. And I think, so, our friend that was vegan was really, anti-dairy, and understandably, right? But through the times of like getting to know her more and sharing kind of what my family's cheese company produces and how it's produced and stuff, there was a time where we picked her up from the airport one time and she's like, "Hey, Ray, I've decided I'm going to eat cheese now, but only from Rumiano Cheese." And I literally almost cried, because it was such a notion of, I trust and respect her perspectives, and I totally understood where she's coming from. The fact that she was able to like take the steps to think through what it meant to her, the humane treatment of the animals, the sustainable aspects, being part of that ecosystem, building the communities, right? It was probably one of the most charming moments of my life. I look back on that very fondly, but I think just, kind of echoing what you were mentioning is there is a lot out there. And again, I'm not trying to discredit any of those negative perspectives or anything out there, because let's face it, not everyone's got the best interest of the resources and the earth in their mind, or the communities, especially at that, or their employees. But, it was just really, it signaled to me like, okay, Rumiano does have something here. Like we are doing something right? It helped me kind of shift my perspective and take myself out of kind of drop my ego, take a step back and look at the bigger picture. And it's like, okay, there's something here that not a lot of other people have. And, on a marketing perspective, that's super handy because now we have a differentiating factor. But on just like a ethical sort of like a human element, it was really powerful to me. So I would implore people to really understand where their food comes from, right? Just understand it, at least understand. I'm not telling you what decisions to make by any means, but just take a look, right? Understand where that came from. And, that's to say, like, I just drank some really awesome tea from China. It's magical tea. It's really magnificent.
Yeah.
And that's okay, right? It doesn't mean it's bad or good. It just is. And I've taken the time to understand where it comes from and how it was made, right? So I choose that tea. So, I think self-education is really important. And, headlines are headlines for a reason, right? They're certainly trying to get your attention. So I think, looking beyond that and taking the, statistics can be morphed into however you really want it to read, right? So yeah, just looking a little deeper into that and understanding a little more is really key.
Right. And once you do that, I think the enjoyment goes, it's triple fold, I feel. Right? Because you really get it. You understand it. And with every taste, I mean, it sounds like a commercial, but it's not really a commercial. But I think you do taste that. And one of the things that I found really, really attractive, and the reason I'm here today, is I had dinner with Patrick and Marlene.
Marlene.
Yep. And we were talking about we got a tour, and Patrick, and they were talking about kind of your culture and what you do. And that was extremely attractive to me because similar to what you are talking about, a negative connotation, the same thing happens with health insurance companies, right? So you come in, think, oh, a health plan, United is a health plan. All we're going to do is no. How do I cut my cost? How do we do this? And as I was earlier telling you, the thing with United Ag is that we're trying to test how would we do right by the people, right? If we are diagnosed with something or we have something happens, how would you like to be treated? And let's create a sustainable business that works for the patient, that works for the business, and that works for anybody associated with that. And that's the challenge. That's the fulfilling part of it. The easy thing is to say no and make lots of money, but is that the right thing to do? So I hope, like your friend, the vegan friend, I hope people say some similar things about United Ag and say, okay, the cheese, I don't really like health insurance, but I like United Ag. That would be awesome because that's through United Ag, through what you're doing through Rumiano Cheese, you're trying to change people's mind and say, by doing right by the people, it can be done.
Yeah.
So others, please listen and do it the right way. Right.
Right.
I mean, that's the message.
Kind of influencing,
correct,
right? That's
correct,
essentially what we're trying to do.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think again, we never intended to do that. We literally generational farms have been doing it the same way. Our families been making the cheese the same way. And granted, I think, in terms of like employee culture and the culture of the company and how's that shifting over the time, it's perpetually evolving almost all the time, right? But I truly appreciate what you're saying. I'm going through that right now. Frankly, I'm trying to find a therapist, and that whole struggle is so difficult. It's so cold and inhuman that it makes it really tough, right? And I appreciate the effort that you're putting into the intention and the drive.
Right, especially mental health, and especially I think it was more so in our agriculture industry because we were we had to be out there, right, during COVID time. So we went through a lot more, and it was still considered a little bit of a taboo in this industry than more so in other industries. And so we are going through all of that, and there is a need for it. And so through United Ag, we're exploring a lot of things to kind of help and people kind of, again, very similar to when you say people tend to put things in buckets, right? People like classifying things. So mental health, behavioral health becomes a bucket. But is that really, your needs could be very different than my needs, and the two of us, the third need is totally different. But I'm going to solve it by one way. Is it doable? No, right? So we're exploring some options where a Ray calling in could have a very different need, and a Kirti calling in could have a different need. And how do we guide that person to the right care?
Sure.
Right? But again, that's going back to understanding first, going deeper, which sometimes we all don't tend to do because the easier thing is not to go deeper and understand.
I'll vouch for that.
And the other thing is just kind of be human. We are humans.
We're all in this together,
let's
right?
All this yeah, exactly. I think COVID has taught us more to be that was a wake-up call for all of us, right? So going back to your cheese, so what is your favorite cheese?
Oh my. I get shunned in the industry for saying this, but I really love American cheese. We used to actually have a lot of, we had cheese that, we have this thing called trim. It's essentially when you take a 40-pound block and cut it into an 8-ounce bar, you're bound to have little bits left over that can't sell. So we used to sell that and turn it into an American cheese. It was an organic American cheese.
That was your favorite?
It was amazing. I think we don't have that anymore, but it's hard to say. I think a really good, well, if we're not speaking about Rumiano cheeses specifically, I think a really good triple cream Camembert Brie sort of is a bloomy rind of any sorts is really my go-to.
So you're not a cheese snob then?
No, certainly not. I spent just kind of before this role that I'm on now, I was a general manager of an e-commerce project through Rumiano. So it was called Board at Home. And we essentially the goal was started up just early COVID, 2020, March 2020 was when we spun this up. But the goal was to highlight a bunch of artisan cheesemakers throughout California that didn't have the ability to have, storefronts buying their cheese and selling it. And they didn't have the cheesemongers. They didn't have their farmers markets, right? They had no outlet for these cheeses. So my goal was the team's goal that helped set this up was really to, how do we highlight them and get people drive to their e-commerce sites and buy their products in the store? And that evolved into doing about 300 different cheese tasting events virtually.
Nice.
With, assorted, tech giants and, insurance companies and, consulting firms that are, the big three, a lot of different ones. And I always started those kind of events just saying, there's no wrong way to enjoy what you're eating. Like, seriously, if you don't like something, that's okay. Yeah. But, I always said, I'm not a cheese snob. I'm not pretentious about cheese. So, but that was like a big important thing to me. It was just like, again, part of that educating the consumer earlier is just, I had some people say like, I've never, ever thought about cheese this way, or I've never even thought about food this way. Right. And it was like, wow, Ray, you're doing more than just telling people about cheese. You're like changing the way people are tasting and eating their product, right? Like that was something special. So
that's pretty cool. We should do something like that with Unite. Because I think that's true when you understand the way you eat and getting people to understand it, especially and how it impacts everything else.
Well, we called it tasting with intention, right? So it's really taking a minute to understand like behind where it came from, but also every second of that taste of that piece of cheese or that wine or that bread, whatever it is, right? It transcends cheese, but it's just thinking about it, and then that can kind of lay into every aspect of your life. Really, just thinking like, what's my intention here? But that's another podcast.
Like it's a mindfulness.
It is. It's a mindful. It really is a mindfulness exercise in a lot of ways. But
going back to your mindfulness, I wonder through cheese and what you do. Like you said, it relates back to everything that we do, right? Have an intention, be mindful of what you do.
Right.
Act of eating cheese and enjoying it. You don't have to rush through it. Yeah. We all are in this rat race. We all want to get somewhere. Some people in my age are talking about retiring and whatever, right? I'm like, live life today like you're retired today. Why can't you live? You craft your life around it, right? So we're always thinking, what next? What's tomorrow? What's this? What my next hour? Sit down and just enjoy the piece of cheese.
Yeah, exactly.
right? It's like
be here
very
now.
Good. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. It was, in retrospect, it's very interesting. I always heard my wife would always tell me, be where your hands are.
Ooh,
and that was really interesting because that is, be where your cheese is in a sense, right? But that helped, cheese was the vessel, right? That it really wasn't about cheese in a lot of ways. Like it was so much more connection with humans. Obviously we're all doing this virtually, but it is. It's about intention, right? It's about just taking a minute and thinking about, okay, like appreciate where you're at if you can. Some people aren't privileged enough to have the ability to appreciate where they're at, right? So I've got to take that with the scope of, lens that I have. But
that's awesome. We would love to do something where like a virtual event, because that's awesome because it connects at so many different levels.
Sure.
So many different levels.
It really does.
Thank you, Ray. This was awesome. I think usually when I go through these interviews, I keep it open because I'm curious and I want to see what I learned from it. But your message about the mindfulness and what we do in our lives and with an intention, and I think what you be where your hand is or be where your cheese is, was beautiful because I'm going to remember that every time, not just eating cheese, but anything, right?
Perpetual challenge to commit to doing that on a always basis. But, that's the beauty of it, I guess, the practice.
And looks like this has been really, really exciting because I can see your energy, I can see your passion, and I'm feeling energized by that. And this is super exciting. So thank you for doing this. And I'm glad I came down here to meet with you.
Well, thanks for journeying all this way. I appreciate it. I know it's not much here, so we appreciate you coming out.
You're here. Come on.